At exactly 10:15 that Saturday morning, I was standing on a polished wooden stage inside Marshall Hall at Fort Belvoir, while cold air blasted from ceiling vents hard enough to make the back of my neck stiff. The auditorium smelled faintly like floor wax, dry paper programs, and starched wool uniforms that had been pressed hours earlier in military housing kitchens all over Northern Virginia. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the room in perfect lines, filled with parents holding phones, spouses fixing collars, and little kids swinging their dress shoes against chair legs because they were bored out of their minds already. I stood perfectly still in my dress blues with my hands locked behind, my back staring at the heavy double doors at the rear of the auditorium. Waiting. A lieutenant, 2 spots down from me, kept glancing toward his wife in the front row every 20 seconds, like he physically couldn't stop smiling. Another officer's mother cried before the ceremony even started and ruined her mascara by 10:11 a.m. Somebody in the audience laughed too loudly at a joke that probably wasn't funny. Normal family stuff. I kept checking those doors anyway. My father had confirmed the night before that he was coming. Actually, confirmed was generous. Richard Vance didn't really confirm things. He announced them like corporate calendar events. Connor and I will leave the club around 7. We'll be there. That was all I got. No congratulations, no proud of you. Just logistics. Still, part of me believed him because becoming a captain wasn't nothing, especially not in my family. Connor got celebrated for breathing near a golf course. I had survived intelligence training, deployment rotations, 18-hour operational shifts, and enough background investigations to make normal people sweat through their shirts. The least my father could do was show up for 45 minutes and pin silver bars on my collar. The command sergeant major stepped to the podium at 10:17 exactly and welcomed everybody to the promotion ceremony. His voice echoed sharply through the auditorium speakers while I kept my eyes forward like protocol demanded, but every few seconds my brain betrayed me. Door. Still closed. A woman near the aisle whispered something to her husband, and both of them smiled toward the stage. Somebody's baby started crying. The MP standing near the side exit looked like he wanted to die from boredom. Door. Still closed. I knew better than to let emotions crawl into my face during ceremony posture. Military cameras catch everything. One weird expression lives forever on somebody's Facebook page, next to an American flag graphic and terrible patriotic music. So I stayed calm, at least externally. The ceremony moved forward with rehearsed precision. Names, ranks, applause, salutes, handshakes. I heard almost none of it. By 10:41, I already knew he wasn't coming. There's a very specific kind of embarrassment that only happens when you defend somebody for years and they still manage to disappoint you in public anyway. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like they're too busy to even hurt you properly. When my name was called, I walked forward with the exact measured pace we'd practiced earlier that morning. My heels clicked against the stage while flashes from audience phones popped across the room. The colonel smiled at me warmly. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant Vance." "Thank you, sir." Then came the awkward pause, the one everybody noticed. The ceremonial officer glanced toward the audience because someone was supposed to join me on stage for the pinning tradition. Usually a parent, a spouse, a sibling, literally anybody who gave enough of a damn to arrive on time. Nobody moved. I heard somebody cough in the audience. The colonel recovered fast because senior officers are professionals who survive disasters for a living. I believe Major Reynolds will assist. My executive officer stepped beside me without hesitation. She gave me a quick look that said she understood exactly what was happening and hated it for me. That almost made it worse. The silver captain bars clicked lightly against my collar as she pinned them into place. The audience applauded politely while I stood there, wondering why humiliation somehow felt colder in air-conditioned rooms. Then it was done. Just like that. Years of work reduced to a 7-second ceremony and an empty seat somewhere behind the crowd. I smiled for photos afterward because military officers are basically trained to function during emotional car crashes. One family near the aisle asked me to take a picture for them. The father had tears in his eyes while hugging his daughter after her promotion. He kept saying how proud he was. I took 4 photos to make sure they got a good one. Then I walked out into the hallway alone. The corridor outside the auditorium was almost empty by then, except for a janitor pushing a gray trash bin toward the elevators. My heels echoed sharply against the tile floor while I finally pulled my phone from my jacket pocket. One unread text. From Dad. Sent at 10:32 a.m. Connor's qualifier ran long. These military events are too rigid with timing anyway. We'll celebrate next weekend. I stared at the screen for a solid 10 seconds. Not because I was shocked. Because I wasn't. That was probably the worst part. There wasn't even enough effort in the message to qualify as cruelty. It read like somebody canceling a dentist appointment. I leaned against the hallway wall beside a faded Fort Belvoir leadership poster and laughed once under my breath. Just once. Because honestly, of course Connor's golf tournament mattered more. Connor missed curfew in high school, and my father called him strong-willed. I got a B+ in chemistry once, and Richard asked if I was getting distracted socially. Connor crashed a leased BMW into a retaining wall at 22 and somehow ended up with a promotion at Vance Aerospace 3 months later. I missed one Sunday dinner during officer training, and my mother acted like I'd abandoned the bloodline. That was the family system. Connor existed. I performed. I looked back down at the message again while people passed me carrying flower bouquets and congratulations balloons from the gift stand near the lobby. Then I opened my collar carefully, removed the pin backing from one side, and secured the silver bars myself. No speech, no scene, no tears running down my face in some dramatic movie moment, just me standing alone in a government hallway under fluorescent lights fastening my own rank onto my own uniform, while a janitor silently pretended not to notice. I pinned my own promotion on at 10:47 that morning, and somehow that told me everything I needed to know about my family. Rain hammered against my apartment windows hard enough to blur the lights from Route 50 into long yellow streaks across the glass. I sat cross-legged on my couch in gray PT shorts and a faded Army Cyber Command sweatshirt while 3 classified logistics routing files glowed across dual encrypted monitors on my desk. My secure government laptop hummed softly beside an empty takeout container from a Thai place downstairs that charged $28 for Pad CEU and somehow still forgot utensils every single time. Tuesday night, 7:42 p.m. Exactly the kind of exciting life people imagine when they hear military intelligence. I rubbed one eye and leaned closer to the screen, reviewing shipment timing discrepancies tied to naval resupply routes in Bahrain. Somebody at Transportation Command had mismatched authorization chains on 2 cargo manifests, which meant my evening had officially become paperwork archaeology. Outside, thunder rolled across Arlington. Inside, my apartment smelled like rain, printer heat, and black coffee that had been sitting untouched for over an hour. Then my personal phone vibrated against the glass coffee table. Not my secure phone, my actual phone. That alone was unusual. Almost nobody contacted me directly anymore unless it was work-related or somebody needed a wedding RSVP answered. Most of my social circle operated on the same exhausted government schedule I did. People texted things like, "You alive?" and considered that emotional vulnerability. The vibration buzzed again. I reached for the phone without really looking. Then I froze halfway through unlocking it. Dad. For a second, I honestly thought somebody in the family had died. That wasn't dramatic thinking. That was statistics. Richard Vance had not contacted me once in years. No birthdays, no holidays. No congratulations after my promotion to major last spring. Nothing. The last interaction we'd had was as a generic Christmas card my mother mailed 3 years earlier with all 4 family names printed in identical cursive like we were running for office together. I opened the message. Dinner tomorrow night, 8 p.m., Blackstone Prime downtown. Connor and your mother will be there too. We should talk. That was it. No greeting. No explanation. No apology for disappearing out of my life for half a decade like a billionaire Batman villain. Just a reservation. I checked the timestamp, 7:41 p.m. 1 minute earlier, my stomach stayed completely still. 5 years ago, that message would have ruined my entire week in the opposite direction. I would have stared at it wondering if this was finally the moment my father decided to act like one. I would have overthought my outfit, rehearsed conversations in the shower, shown up early. Back then, I still believed love and approval were basically the same thing. 34-year-old me knew better. I set the phone down slowly and leaned back against the couch cushions while rain rattled the balcony railing outside. Blackstone Prime wasn't just expensive. It was Washington Power expensive. $150 steaks, private wine lockers, federal contractors pretending they didn't own senators, the kind of restaurant where waiters somehow knew your security clearance before taking your drink order. My father hated spending money without purpose. which meant this wasn't dinner. This was acquisition strategy. I stared at the message another minute before opening my laptop browser and searching Vance Aerospace Contracting. The company homepage looked exactly the same as it always had. Patriotic branding, smiling engineers in safety goggles, American flags large enough to invade a small country. But the news section caught my attention immediately. Vance Aerospace had recently entered final stage review for a Department of Defense logistics modernization contract worth just over $12 million. Interesting. I clicked another article, then another. 3 new federal partnerships in 8 months. Rapid expansion into military supply chain operations. Increased oversight from Defense Logistics Agency compliance auditors. That last part mattered. Government contracts at that level came with invasive scrutiny, financial reviews, security reviews, supplier verification, background investigations, especially for executive leadership, especially if classified logistics were involved. I picked up my phone again and reread the message. Connor and your mother will be there too. Translation: this wasn't personal, this was coordinated. A memory surfaced before I could stop it. I was 19, home from freshman year at Georgetown for Thanksgiving break. Connor had failed 2 business courses and gotten arrested for public intoxication outside a country club in McLean. My father spent the entire holiday yelling at me because my internship with a congressional defense committee made Connor feel insecure. That was Richard Vance in one sentence. Connor created disasters. Everybody else adjusted around them. I muted the logistics files on my monitor and walked into the kitchen for fresh coffee, even though it was already late enough to ruin my sleep schedule. Rainwater streaked down the windows over the sink while I stood there, waiting for the machine to finish brewing. My apartment was quiet except for thunder and the occasional encrypted email notification from my work laptop. 5 years changes people in ways families never notice. Back at 29, I still reacted emotionally first. Now my brain automatically started threat assessment before feelings even entered the room. Why now? Why dinner? Why altogether? And most importantly, what did they need badly enough to break 5 years of silence? Because men like Richard Vance didn't suddenly discover emotional accountability at 62. They discovered leverage problems. I carried the coffee back to the living room and sat down, again while my phone rested face up beside the files. The screen lit briefly from another incoming message. Dad again. Business casual. I laughed out loud alone in my apartment. Not because it was funny, because it was so perfectly him. 5 years of silence, and apparently the urgent follow-up detail was dress code coordination. I looked toward the rain-covered skyline outside my balcony and felt something strange settle into place inside me. Not anger, not hope either. Distance. Cold, clean distance. The kind you earn after enough disappointment finally burns the confusion out of you. My therapist once told me that emotionally manipulative people hate silence because silence removes their control over the narrative. Richard had lost access to mine years ago. Still, I couldn't ignore the invitation completely. Families like mine operated like corporations pretending to be blood relatives. Nobody scheduled formal dinners unless money, reputation, or legal exposure was involved. And instinctively, deep down somewhere beneath the military training and the years of separation, I already knew this dinner had nothing to do with reconciliation. Affection was never the product in my family. Transactions were. I picked up the phone one last time and typed exactly 4 words back to my father. I'll be there. Then I locked the screen and returned to the classified routing reports while thunder rolled over Washington like distant artillery. The hostess smiled a little too professionally when she led me through the main dining room at Blackstone Prime the next evening. The restaurants smelled like expensive bourbon, seared meat, and money people were trying very hard not to discuss openly. Dark mahogany walls reflected low amber lighting across white linen tablecloths while lobbyists, defense consultants, and men with government badges laughed softly over steaks that cost more than most car payments. I spotted my family immediately, not because I missed them, because tension has a shape to it. My father sat at the center of the booth in a navy Brioni suit, with a silver watch peeking beneath his cuff like he wanted people to notice he'd done well for himself. My mother sat beside him in pearl earrings and a cream-colored jacket that probably cost somebody else's mortgage payment. Connor looked freshly scrubbed and uncomfortable in a charcoal blazer he clearly hadn't picked himself. 3 half-empty wine glasses already sat on the table. Interesting. That meant they needed alcohol before I arrived. Connor stood first when he saw me approaching. Harper. His voice cracked slightly on my name. Also interesting. I slid into the booth across from them and placed my phone face down beside the folded cloth napkin. Connor. Then I looked at my mother. Elaine gave me a tight smile that barely moved her mouth. You look thin. There it was, 5 years of silence, and somehow she'd still found a way to open with criticism disguised as concern. Honestly, it was almost comforting in a deeply damaged kind of way. You look expensive, I said calmly. Connor coughed into his water glass, trying not to laugh. My father ignored all of it. Good to see you, sweetheart. Sweetheart. That word almost made me choke on air. Richard Vance only used affectionate language when he was either negotiating or lying. Sometimes both. A waiter appeared instantly beside the table, like he'd been hiding behind a curtain, waiting for my father to feel important. We'll take the Bordeaux Reserve, Dad said without looking at the menu. The 2016, the waiter asked. Obviously. The waiter disappeared. My father folded his hands neatly on the table and leaned forward slightly. You look good, Harper. Major now, right? I stared at him for maybe 2 full seconds. You knew that already. Silence. Tiny. Sharp. Connor shifted comfortably beside him while my mother suddenly became fascinated with her wine glass stem. Richard recovered quickly. Of course I did. I meant, it suits you. There was something almost fascinating about watching a man who negotiated federal contracts for a living struggle through basic human interaction with his own daughter. Then came the performance. He asked about my apartment, my hours, whether I still lived near Arlington. All surface-level questions designed to imitate fatherhood without requiring emotional investment. I answered politely, while mentally tracking the room like I was sitting through an intelligence briefing instead of dinner. Connor barely spoke. My mother kept drinking, and my father watched me too carefully. Not emotionally, strategically. The waiter returned with the Bordeaux and poured small tasting amounts into my father's glass. Richard swirled it around dramatically like he was auditioning for Succession. Then finally, after 23 minutes of fake conversation and appetizer menus nobody intended to order from, he exhaled slowly and changed tone. I think enough time has passed for us to move forward as a family. There it was. Corporate language. Not I'm sorry, not I hurt you. Just a merger proposal with emotional packaging. I leaned back slightly in the booth. What exactly are we moving toward? Connor immediately looked down at the table. My father smiled tightly. Straight to business. Still military. Still manipulative. Nobody said it out loud. A steak knife clinked against porcelain somewhere across the restaurant while rain streaked the tall front windows facing K Street outside. Then Richard reached down beside his chair and pulled up a thick manila folder. Unmarked, heavy. He slid it slowly across the white tablecloth toward me. Every instinct I had sharpened instantly. Because people in my professional world did not slide unmarked folders across tables, unless they were either very stupid or very desperate. I rested my fingertips lightly against the folder, but didn't open it yet. What is this? Dad lowered his voice. An opportunity. I almost laughed. Connor still hadn't touched his drink in 10 minutes. That told me more than the folder already had. Richard leaned closer across the table while his expensive executive confidence tightened around the edges. Vance Aerospace is in final review for a Department of Defense logistics contract, $12.4 million. There was the number. Precise, prepared, rehearsed. We've expanded aggressively the past 18 months, he continued. New supplier chains, new operational divisions. But because of the classified routing access involved, the government is conducting enhanced background scrutiny on executive leadership. I said nothing. He took that as permission to continue. Connor's overseeing operations now. Naturally, his clearance review became part of the process. Connor shifted again beside him. My father placed both palms flat against the tablecloth. And frankly, Harper, having a decorated intelligence officer with top-secret SCI credentials vouch for his liability would carry significant weight. There it was. Finally, not family reconciliation, not guilt, not love, paperwork. I opened the folder carefully. Inside sat clearance forms, internal recommendation drafts, compliance summaries, and a partially completed endorsement statement requiring federal verification signatures. Mine, specifically. I read the first page silently while my mother finally decided to contribute. It's really just procedural support, honey. Amazing how fast families rediscover terms of affection when prison becomes statistically possible. I flipped another page. then another. Everything was already prepared. They hadn't invited me to discuss anything. Connor invited me to come quietly. It would help stabilize things. I looked up at him. Things. He swallowed hard. The company. The company. Not our relationship. Not the family. The company. My father leaned in again and lowered his voice almost conspiratorially. Harper, this isn't illegal. We just need somebody credible to verify Connor's character and trustworthiness during the review process. I stared at him calmly, because that sentence alone told me he already knew there was a problem. People who aren't guilty never explain legality before being accused. I closed the folder carefully and rested both hands on top of it. Across the restaurant, somebody laughed loudly near the bar while soft jazz played overhead through hidden speakers. Normal dinner sounds. Normal Washington night. Meanwhile, my father was asking a military intelligence officer to attach her federal credibility to something he very clearly did not want examined too closely. And the worst part wasn't the request itself. It was how natural he made it sound. Like this was what daughters were for. They didn't miss me. They needed clearance access wearing a human face. I carried the manila folder into my office the next morning without opening it again once during the drive. Northern Virginia traffic crawled through light fog while NPR muttered quietly through my speakers about congressional budget negotiations and a senator under ethics investigation. Normal DC, background noise. By 6:48 a.m., I was already inside the Secure Operations Building at Fort Meade, holding burnt coffee in one hand and my badge against the scanner with the other. The lobby smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and stale air conditioning. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, while a sleepy specialist at the front desk nodded at me without looking up from his monitor. "Morning, ma'am." The elevator doors shut behind me with a metallic thud. I didn't feel angry. That would have been simpler. Anger gives you momentum. Anger lets you slam folders onto tables and call people monsters. What I felt sitting there in the elevator was colder than that. Professional curiosity. Because somewhere between the wine glasses, rehearsed smiles, and Connor sweating through a $9,000 blazer, my instincts had started whispering something important. People do not risk contacting estranged relatives with federal clearance access unless normal solutions have already failed. I reached my office, locked the door behind me, and placed the folder carefully beside my keyboard. Then I opened public federal contractor databases. Nothing classified, nothing illegal. Just compliance records, procurement filings, supplier disclosures, audit trails, and defense logistics documentation available to authorized oversight personnel and contracting reviewers. The boring adult version of crime scene photography. I typed in Vance Aerospace Contracting. Hundreds of entries appeared instantly. Award histories, procurement renewals, vendor certifications, transportation partnerships. At first glance, everything looked polished enough to frame in a corporate lobby. Richard always understood appearances better than morality. But appearances create patterns, and patterns eventually get lazy. By 7:06 a.m., I noticed the first discrepancy. A supplier certification linked to secondary component sourcing had been quietly amended 3 times in 11 months. Not impossible, just unusual. I opened the filing history, then another, then another. Coffee went cold beside my keyboard while rain tapped softly against the narrow office window overlooking the parking structure outside. At 8:03, my stomach tightened for the first time. Defense Logistics Agency review flags. Internal, low visibility. Not criminal yet, but definitely not clean. I sat back slightly in my chair and reread the notation carefully. Pending verification of foreign origin microelectronic subcomponents utilized within expedited naval routing support systems. That sentence looked harmless to civilians. To me, it looked like somebody juggling lit dynamite inside a gasoline warehouse. Military logistics systems don't get to play guessing games with foreign hardware, especially not unverified components moving through classified or semi-classified routing infrastructure. One compromised microchip inside defense systems could expose operational vulnerabilities halfway around the world. Troop movements, supply chain timing, communication pathways. People died over mistakes smaller than that. I opened another report, then another. The deeper I dug, the uglier it became. Connor's division had apparently authorized second tertiary sourcing through subcontractor layers that bypassed normal verification procedures during a shipping backlog 18 months earlier. The paperwork trail looked messy, rushed, and carefully diluted across shell vendors like somebody hoped nobody would ever connect the dots. But federal systems always connect dots eventually, especially when money gets involved. I checked timestamps. Internal compliance inquiry initiated 8 months ago. Escalated review recommendation 4 months later. Executive level disclosure requests pending. Jesus Christ. I rubbed my thumb slowly against the edge of my coffee mug while staring at the monitor. This wasn't a technicality. This wasn't some harmless accounting issue my father wanted help smoothing over. Connor had potentially inserted unverified foreign manufactured microelectronics into military logistical infrastructure tied to Department of Defense operations. And now federal auditors were circling. Suddenly, last night's dinner made perfect sense. Not emotionally, operationally. I pulled the endorsement packet closer and opened it again beside the compliance reports. The language hit differently now. Character verification, trustworthiness assessment, executive reliability endorsement. Every phrase suddenly looked radioactive. My name, my rank, my clearance. They wanted all three attached to Connor before federal investigators finalized their review process. Not because they loved me, because decorated military officers create credibility buffers, especially female officers with spotless records and active intelligence credentials. People like me photographed well inside federal oversight packets. We looked stable, ethical, safe. My father wasn't asking me to help family, he was asking me to contaminate an investigation. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling tiles for a long moment while somebody laughed faintly somewhere down the hallway outside my office. 5 years. 5 entire years without speaking to me. Then suddenly I mattered again, because Connor might be heading toward criminal exposure. Honestly, the part that hurt most wasn't even the manipulation anymore. It was how little they thought of my career. Do you know how many background checks you survive to hold top-secret SCI access? How many interviews, financial reviews, psychological evaluations, foreign contact disclosures, polygraphs? One knowingly false federal endorsement could destroy everything I'd built since I was 22 years old. Clearance revoked. Career terminated. Potential criminal liability. And Richard had slid it across a steakhouse table like he was asking me to co-sign a car loan. My office phone rang suddenly, jolting me out of the silence. I picked it up immediately. Major Vance. Morning, ma'am, a civilian analyst said. Need your approval on the Bahrain routing revisions before 10. I'll review them shortly. I hung up and looked back at the screen, then at the folder, then back again. Somewhere deep underneath the professionalism and training and years of emotional distance, a small, ugly part of me still wanted this to be misunderstood somehow. Maybe Connor didn't know. Maybe Richard exaggerated. Maybe this was salvageable. Then I opened one final compliance attachment buried near the bottom of the review history. A digitally archived executive acknowledgement signature dated 14 months earlier. Connor Vance. He knew. I stared at his signature for several seconds. Then I closed the file carefully, not dramatically, not emotionally, just quietly. Because in that exact moment, the entire situation changed shapes inside my head. This was no longer a difficult family conversation. This was evidence. And my father had invited a military intelligence officer to dinner hoping she'd help bury it. The favor wasn't unethical. The favor was a felony. I closed Connor's compliance file at 6:14 Thursday evening and didn't contact my family afterward. Not my father, not Connor, not even my mother. Silence is incredibly effective when manipulative people expect panic. By Friday morning, apparently, Richard Vance had decided to escalate. At exactly 9:05 a.m., my office extension rang while I was reviewing encrypted routing updates from CENTCOM. I picked up without looking away from the monitor. Major Vance. A pause. Then the unmistakably irritated voice of Sergeant Diaz from the visitor control desk downstairs. Ma'am, your father is here. I stopped typing. Not emotionally, operationally, because nobody just showed up at a secure military installation unless they were either reckless, stupid, or accustomed to never hearing the word no. Clarify here, Sergeant. Another pause. Then quieter this time. He's currently arguing with the MPs in the main visitor lobby. Of course he was. I closed the classified routing file immediately and locked my workstation while Sergeant Diaz continued speaking over the line. He says this is a family emergency and keeps demanding immediate access. Has he been cleared through visitor processing? No, ma'am. Then he stays where he is. Understood. I hung up calmly and stood from my desk while my pulse settled into that strange, cold steadiness military training drills into you after enough years. not fear, not anger, assessment. I walked to the coat rack near my office door and slipped into my dress uniform jacket because, unfortunately, if Richard Vance was going to create a scene inside a federal building, I preferred to outrank the room visually. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone vibrated again. Dad. Ignored. Then immediately again. Ignored. The elevator doors slid open onto the lobby level with a soft, mechanical chime. And honestly, the scene waiting downstairs would have been funny under different circumstances. My father stood near the visitor screening counter in a charcoal overcoat and polished leather shoes that probably cost more than an enlisted soldier's monthly grocery budget. His face was flushed red with frustration, while he gestured aggressively at two military police officers standing between him and the secured access corridor. "I don't think you're understanding me," he was saying loudly. "My daughter works here." One of the MPs, a staff sergeant with shoulders the size of refrigerators, answered without blinking. "And I don't think you're understanding me, sir. You still require authorization. I run a defense contracting company worth over $80 million. The MP stared at him blankly. "Congratulations." I almost smiled. Richard looked like he'd accidentally wandered into a universe where money stopped functioning as a personality trait. The lobby itself was aggressively government-looking, gray concrete walls, bullet-resistant glass panels, fluorescent lighting, security cameras mounted at every angle. The air smelled faintly like coffee and printer toner. No chandeliers, no wine service, no assistants rushing to validate his ego. Just procedure, and procedure does not care who your father is. One of the civilian analysts sitting near the waiting area pretended very hard not to watch the argument while absolutely watching every second of it. Then my father saw me stepping out of the secured elevator bay. His entire posture changed instantly. "Harper," loud enough for the whole lobby. I kept walking forward calmly, heels clicking sharply against the tile floor while both MPs stepped slightly aside once they recognized me. "Major Vance," one of them said professionally. "Thank you, Sergeant." Dad pointed immediately toward the security desk like a man filing a customer service complaint. "This is ridiculous." I looked at him evenly. "You attempted to enter a restricted military facility without authorization. I came to speak with my daughter. You came to bypass federal access procedures. Tiny difference." Connor would have folded instantly under this kind of pressure. My father, meanwhile, kept trying to dominate rooms long after rooms stopped responding to him. He lowered his voice slightly, probably realizing by now that half the lobby was listening. "You haven't returned my calls." "Correct." His jaw tightened. "This situation requires urgency. There is no situation for me." That hit him harder than I expected. Because men like Richard build their entire worldview around influence. If a problem threatens them, they automatically assume it threatens everyone connected to them too. But standing there in uniform with armed MPs beside us and federal cameras, covering every square foot of the lobby, I wasn't his daughter first anymore. I was a field-grade officer inside a secured installation. Different hierarchy, different rules. And, for the first time in his life, my father couldn't brute force his way through either. He stepped closer toward me instinctively. Both MPs immediately shifted their stance. Subtle, professional, hands resting near duty belts. Not threatening, just prepared. And suddenly I watched something fascinating happen in real time. Richard noticed the posture change, noticed the distance. Noticed that nobody here cared about his company, his money, or his expensive watch. Authority inside this building came from clearance levels, protocols, and rank insignia stitched onto uniforms, not tax brackets. His entire demeanor softened by almost 10% immediately. "Harper," he said more carefully, "we need to discuss the endorsement paperwork before things become unnecessarily complicated." There it was again. Complicated. Corporate people loved vague language when crime started entering conversations. I folded my hands behind my back calmly. I reviewed the files. For the first time since arriving, genuine fear flickered across his face. Gone almost instantly. But I saw it. Years in intelligence work teaches you to notice tiny fractures in people. Connor got that exact same look once at 16 after backing my father's Mercedes into a retaining wall and trying to blame valet parking. Richard glanced briefly toward the surrounding lobby before lowering his voice further. "This isn't the place." "No," I agreed calmly. "It isn't." His eyes searched my face for something familiar. Sympathy, maybe. Loyalty. Weakness. Instead, he found military posture and emotional distance. I think that's when he finally understood the mistake he'd made. 5 years earlier, he skipped my promotion ceremony because military structure felt inconvenient to him. Now he was standing inside that exact structure, realizing it had finished raising me without his help. The little girl who waited by auditorium doors for his approval no longer existed, and whatever authority he thought he still had over me ended right here at the gate. I nodded once toward the hallway beside the security desk and watched relief flood across my father's face so quickly it almost embarrassed me for him. He thought privacy meant advantage. That had always been his favorite mistake. The observation room sat just off the main visitor lobby behind a thick glass door with a metal push bar and fluorescent lighting, harsh enough to make everybody look tired. The room held a rectangular steel table bolted to the floor, 4 molded plastic chairs, and a government-issued wall clock that ticked loud enough to feel passive-aggressive. No decorations, no warmth, just concrete, glass, and federal budget cuts. I closed the door behind us while Richard immediately loosened his tie, like the hallway itself had physically attacked him. Interesting. 5 minutes earlier, he was trying to dominate military police officers in public. Now he looked like a man sitting outside an IRS audit hearing. I remained standing. He sat down heavily across from me and rubbed both palms against his slacks before speaking. Harper, thank God. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because hearing my father use relief instead of authority felt like watching a tiger ask somebody for directions. You have exactly 5 minutes, I said calmly. His eyes flicked briefly toward the wall clock. Then the performance finally cracked. Not all at once, just enough. The polished executive confidence started slipping around the edges while sweat gathered faintly near his temples. His expensive suit suddenly looked too tight across the shoulders. We have federal auditors arriving Monday morning, he said quietly. Today was Friday, 48 hours. There it was. No more fake family reunion. No more wine and rehearsed smiles. Just panic-wearing Italian leather. I stayed silent. That made him continue faster. The situation has been exaggerated internally. Connor made procedural sourcing decisions during a supply shortage, and now compliance reviewers are treating it like criminal fraud. Procedural sourcing decisions. Corporate people really could sandpaper the edges off anything. Arson probably became unexpected thermal expansion in Richard's world. He leaned forward urgently. If your endorsement goes through before final review, it changes the context of the investigation. Your clearance level alone establishes institutional confidence. Institutional confidence. Amazing. My entire military career reduced to branding material. I folded my arms slowly. You asked me to submit knowingly false federal statements. His face tightened immediately. No, absolutely not. You wanted me to certify Connor's operational reliability while federal compliance flags already exist against his division. Those flags are administrative. They involve unverified foreign microelectronics entering military logistics infrastructure. His silence lasted maybe 1 second too long, and there it was again. Fear. Real fear this time. Richard Vance built his life on controlling rooms through certainty. Watching him lose that certainty piece by piece felt strangely less satisfying than I'd imagined all those years ago. Honestly, it just looked exhausting. He lowered his voice further. Connor did not understand the exposure level when those sourcing contracts were approved. He signed executive acknowledgement 14 months ago. That hit him hard enough, he physically leaned back in the chair, because now he understood something important. I knew everything, not emotionally, documentationally. For a moment, the room went completely quiet, except for the ticking wall clock and muffled lobby noise bleeding through the glass outside. Then my father did something I genuinely never expected to witness in my lifetime. He begged. Not dramatically, not on his knees or anything theatrical. That would have at least carried dignity. No, Richard Vance begged the way rich men do when they aren't practiced at it, quietly, frantically, like negotiation suddenly stopped obeying them. Harper, please? I stared at him. He rubbed both hands over his face and exhaled shakily. If this audit escalates formally, Connor could face federal prosecution. There it was, finally. Truth without packaging. How much exposure? I asked calmly. His jaw flexed tightly. Potentially 8 to 10 years. The number hung in the sterile room like bad weather. 8 to 10 years. Federal prison. Connor. The same kid who once cried for 2 straight hours because my father took away his Range Rover for a weekend after he got caught cheating in college. I almost couldn't picture it. Richard leaned closer again desperately. He's your brother. I said nothing. Elaine's blood pressure has been through the roof since this started. There it was, up in his motherhood. Predictable. Your mother's health is not relevant to federal supplier fraud. Jesus Christ. Harper. He actually sounded offended. Like professionalism from me was somehow cruelty. He pointed sharply toward the glass wall overlooking the lobby. Everything this family built is on the line right now. I looked at him steadily. That sentence explained more about my childhood than 20 years of therapy ever did. Not Connor's future, not morality, not national security, the family brand, the company, the Vance name, always the Vance name. I thought back suddenly to that auditorium 5 years earlier, the empty doors, the unread text message. Connor's golf qualifier apparently mattering more than my promotion ceremony. At the time, I thought my father skipped it because he didn't respect military structure. Now I understood the deeper truth. He only respected systems he could control. And military service never belonged to him. That was why he mocked it. That was why he minimized it. That was why sitting in this ugly government observation room terrified him now. Because rank, protocol, and federal law couldn't be bullied at a country club dinner. For the first time since entering the room, I actually felt something close to sadness. Not for Connor, for him. For this aging man sweating through an expensive suit while desperately trying to use his daughter as legal's insulation against consequences he helped create. A multi-million-dollar empire balanced entirely on shortcuts, intimidation, and the assumption that somebody else would absorb the fallout eventually. Probably me. I reached into the folder beside me and removed the endorsement paperwork carefully. Richard watched my hands like a drowning man watching a life raft drift closer. Then I placed the unsigned forms flat onto the steel table between us. My integrity is not your safety net. The sentence landed quietly, no yelling, no dramatic music moment, just truth. And somehow that hit him harder than anger would have. His face collapsed slightly after that, not emotionally, structurally, like a building finally realizing the foundation underneath it had already cracked. I pushed the unsigned endorsement packet slowly across the steel table toward my father and watched his hand stay frozen beside it. He didn't touch the papers, almost like physical contact would make the reality official. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, while the wall clock continued ticking loud enough to irritate me. Outs the observation room, blurred figures moved through the visitor lobby beyond the glass walls. Soldiers, contractors, civilian analysts carrying coffee cups and security badges. Normal Friday morning. Meanwhile, my father looked like a man sitting inside the final 10 minutes of his old life. "Harper," he said quietly, not angry anymore, just tired. I stood from the chair and adjusted the front of my dress uniform jacket automatically. Years in military environments train small movements into your body until they become instinctive. Straighten the collar, check the sleeves, maintain posture, control what you can control. My father watched me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Maybe confusion, maybe regret, or maybe he was simply realizing something uncomfortable for the first time. The discipline he mocked for years had built somebody he could no longer manipulate. Then the glass door behind me opened. 3 people stepped into the room. The first was Sergeant Diaz from downstairs. The second wore a dark gray federal suit with a blue identification badge clipped neatly beside his belt. The third carried a hard-sided document case. The suited man looked directly at my father. Richard Vance? Every ounce of color drained from my father's face immediately. He stood too quickly from the chair. "What is this?" The man stepped forward calmly and extended a sealed document envelope. Special Agent Thomas Miller, Defense Investigative Service. Professional voice, no emotion. The kind federal investigators develop after years of delivering bad news to people who think money changes outcomes. My father stared at the envelope without taking it. Agent Miller continued anyway. "You are hereby served with a federal subpoena requiring immediate production of unredacted shipping manifests, supplier communications, executive authorization records, and subcontractor sourcing documentation related to Vance Aerospace Logistics operations between January of last year and present day." The room went completely silent. Not dramatic silence, administrative silence. The kind that settles over spaces once everybody understands lawyers are about to become extremely expensive. Richard finally accepted the envelope with visibly shaking hands. "No," he said quietly. "No, there has to be some mistake." Agent Miller didn't even blink. "There is no mistake, sir." My father looked toward me then. And in that exact moment, I watched the entire situation finally connect inside his head. The reports, the compliance flags, my silence, the timing. He realized I hadn't merely discovered the anomaly. I had reported it, properly, legally, immediately. Exactly the way a military intelligence officer is required to report potential foreign hardware compromise involving Department of Defense logistics infrastructure. His mouth opened slightly. He started, then stopped. Because what exactly was he supposed to accuse me of? Doing my job? Following federal protocol? Protecting military operational security? Agent Miller opened the hard-sided case beside him and removed several additional documents while continuing in the same calm voice. Further obstruction, document destruction, or knowingly false disclosure during this review process may result in additional criminal exposure. Connor would have fainted hearing that sentence. Richard just looked old suddenly, older than 62. The kind of aging that happens in real time once powerful people realize systems they used to manipulate are now moving independently without their permission. He turned toward me fully. You reported your own family? There it was. Not you reported federal misconduct. Not you protected classified infrastructure. Just family. Always family when accountability finally arrived. I looked at him steadily across the steel table. I reported a foreign hardware anomaly tied to military logistics systems. His breathing turned shallow. You could have warned us. Agent Miller glanced briefly between us, but wisely stayed silent. I buttoned the front of my mic jacket calmly before entering. No, I couldn't, and I meant that. People imagine integrity as this dramatic, heroic feeling, like courage, like pride. Honestly, most of the time it feels inconvenient and lonely, especially when the people asking you to compromise aren't strangers. They're blood relatives sitting across from you, using childhood memories like bargaining chips. My father rubbed one hand across his forehead shakily. Connor's life is over. That almost hurt to hear. Not because it wasn't partially true. Because for the first time in years, he sounded less like a CEO and more like somebody's scared father. But consequences don't stop being real just because emotions finally enter the room late. I looked at him carefully. Then at the subpoena papers, still trembling slightly in his hand. Then back again. 5 years ago, he skipped my promotion ceremony because military structure was too rigid for his schedule. Now that same structure was standing in front of him with federal authority and subpoena power. Funny how quickly rigid systems become important once they're the only thing separating your company from criminal collapse. Outside the glass wall, 2 junior enlisted soldiers walked past, laughing about something on a phone screen, completely unaware that a multi-million-dollar defense contractor was imploding 20 feet away from them. The world keeps moving even when your personal disaster feels enormous. Agent Miller closed the document case. Will require full cooperation beginning Monday at 0800. Richard barely nodded. Gone was the polished executive voice. Gone was the performance. Gone was the man who thought expensive dinners and family guilt could override federal oversight. All that remained now was a frightened older man sitting under fluorescent lights, realizing his daughter could not be bought back into the family system he'd built. And strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious. Just clear, calm, certain. I stepped toward the door while my father remained frozen beside the steel table, clutching subpoena paperwork like it might physically bite him. Then I stopped briefly and looked back one final time. Military service isn't about wearing a uniform, I said quietly. It's about holding the line when the people you love ask you not to. He stared at me silently. No comeback, no negotiation, no authority left. And that was the moment I finally understood something important about power. Real power doesn't scream. Real power doesn't threaten. Real power quietly follows procedure while everybody else panics around it. I opened the glass door and walked back into the secure lobby while the federal investigation continued behind me. I didn't need to destroy my father. The truth was already doing that for me. The coffee tasted terrible that morning. Burnt, too strong, exactly how I liked it. I stood barefoot on my apartment balcony at 6:18 a.m. watching pale orange sunlight spread slowly across the Potomac River while cold November air drifted through Arlington. Traffic hadn't fully started yet. The world still carried that quiet Sunday feeling where even Washington seemed briefly exhausted from itself. 6 months had passed since the subpoena landed on the steel table in that observation room. 6 months since my father realized federal investigators were no longer asking questions politely. And 6 months since I finally stopped waiting for my family to become people they had never actually been. A jogger moved along the Riverside Trail below wearing neon gloves and regrettable running shorts, despite the temperature sitting somewhere around 39 degrees. Across the water, the skyline slowly brightened behind Georgetown while steam curled upward from my coffee mug into the cold air. Inside my apartment, the television played quietly from the living room, muted. Some Sunday political show with three men arguing about national security while wearing makeup and pretending not to hate each other. Standard DC programming. I took another sip of coffee and leaned against the balcony railing. Vance Aerospace no longer existed in any meaningful way. Not officially yet. Corporate collapse takes paperwork. Lawyers stretch funerals out when enough money is involved. But operationally, finished. Federal investigators uncovered far more than the foreign microchip violations after digging into supplier chains and procurement records. Once auditors started pulling threads, entire sections of the company unraveled underneath them. Contract inflation, fraudulent sourcing disclosures, executive authorization irregularities. 3 separate shell vendors registered through Delaware addresses connected to the same holding group. Apparently, my father had spent years building a defense contracting empire the same way gamblers build casino debt, confidently. Connor accepted a plea agreement in August, reduced charges in exchange for cooperation and internal documentation access. No prison sentence yet, though federal sentencing guidelines were still hanging over his head like a thunderstorm. Nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. Last I heard, he was living in a small townhouse in Alexandria and working for some logistics startup owned by a former college friend. No luxury office, no assistant, no company car. Honestly, it was probably the first normal thing that had ever happened to him. My mother called twice after the indictment became public. I didn't answer either time. Not out of cruelty. I just didn't know what conversation was left anymore. What exactly were we supposed to discuss? Weather? Federal fraud? The fact that she spent 30 years watching my father turn love into leverage and never once interrupted him. Some silences are healthier than explanations. A cold gust of wind moved across the balcony, making me pull my sweatshirt sleeves lower over my hands. For a while after the investigation started, I expected to feel guilt eventually. Or triumph. Maybe even grief. Instead, what arrived surprised me, relief. Not loud relief either. Quiet relief. The kind that settles into your nervous system after years of carrying tension you stopped noticing because it became normal. I no longer checked my phone expecting manipulation disguised as concern. I no longer replayed old conversations wondering whether I had somehow failed my family by refusing to absorb their damage for them. And strangest of all, I no longer felt small around the Vance name. That took longer to understand. When you grow up inside families like mine, approval becomes currency before you even realize you're earning it. You start measuring your worth through performance reviews that nobody formally announces. Connor received affection automatically. I received expectations. He made mistakes. I represented consequences. Even my success only mattered when it benefited the family image somehow. Good grades looked impressive publicly. Military promotions sounded respectable at country club dinners. A daughter with intelligence clearance became useful once federal investigators entered the picture. But usefulness is not love. And eventually, if you're lucky, adulthood teaches you the difference. A barge moved slowly along the river while distant church bells rang somewheres across the city. I thought briefly about my father. Not the CEO version. Not the angry version from the observation room. Just the aging man sitting there under fluorescent lights realizing too late that money could buy influence, lawyers, and temporary silence, but not integrity. Definitely not integrity. That part has to exist before the crisis starts. I set my coffee mug down on the balcony railing and breathed in the cold air slowly. The thing nobody tells you about boundaries is that they don't feel powerful at first. They feel lonely, especially when the people forcing those boundaries are your parents. There were nights over the past 6 months where I sat awake wondering whether a different daughter would have handled things differently. Softer maybe. More forgiving. Then I'd remember the compliance reports, the suppler records, the possibility of compromised military systems moving through operational networks because executives wanted faster profits and fewer delays. And every time the answer stayed the same. No, I did the right thing. Not because it was emotionally satisfying, Because soldiers serving overseas deserve supply chains, they can trust more than corrupt executives deserve protection from consequences. That clarity mattered to me now, more than family approval ever had. The sun climbed higher above the river, while morning traffic finally started building in the distance. Somewhere below, somebody laughed loudly near the apartment entrance, while a dog barked twice at absolutely nothing. Normal life continuing. I wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug again and allowed myself one final thought before heading back inside. 5 years ago, I stood alone in a military hallway, pinning my own captain bars onto my uniform because my father decided my promotion ceremony wasn't worth missing a golf tournament. At the time, I thought that moment meant I was alone. Turns out it meant I was free. Because dignity is not something families hand you when they're finally ready to behave correctly. It's something you build quietly through decisions nobody claps for while you're making them. And somewhere along the way, without even noticing it happen, I had finally outranked their shadows. A few weeks after everything collapsed, I was sitting in traffic outside Pentagon City when I realized something that honestly should have been obvious years earlier. I had spent most of my life trying to earn love from people who only understood usefulness. Not love. Usefulness. There's a difference, and if you grew up in certain families, you probably felt that difference long before you had words for it. Some kids grow up believing they're loved because they exist. Other kids grow up believing they're loved when they perform correctly. Good grades, good behavior, good career, no inconvenience, no emotional needs. You become the child who adapts fastest, works hardest, causes the fewest problems, and somehow still feels permanently one mistake away from disappointing everybody. That was me for most of my life. And the dangerous part is people praise you for it. Teachers call you mature. Bosses call you dependable. Family members call you the strong one. Meanwhile, you're running yourself into the ground, trying to earn emotional safety from people who may not even know how to give it. Connor and I grew up in the exact same house, but we learned completely different survival skills. Connor learned that charm could erase consequences. I learned that achievement could buy temporary approval. Neither one was healthy. Mine just looked more respectable on paper. I think that's why high-functioning people from emotionally manipulative families often confuse exhaustion with self-worth. We become addicted to proving ourselves because proving ourselves feels safer than asking to simply be loved as is. And eventually, if you're not careful, you carry that pattern into every part of adulthood. Relationships, friendships, careers. You overgive, overexplain, overachieve. You become emotionally fluent in earning your seat at tables where healthy people would simply sat down. One thing I really need people watching this story to understand is that toxic family dynamics rarely look dramatic all the time. Most of the damage happens quietly, through patterns. Who gets forgiven instantly? Who gets blamed automatically? Who becomes responsible for everyone else's emotions? Who only gets contacted during emergencies? Who gets celebrated publicly but emotionally ignored privately? That stuff matters. And once you notice the pattern, you can't unsee it anymore. Looking back now, my father contacting me after 5 years of silence wasn't actually shocking. What shocked me was how quickly I understood the reason. That's how much clarity distance gives you. 5 years earlier, I would have mistaken that dinner invitation for reconciliation. At 34, I recognized it immediately for what it was, a transaction. And I know some people watching this are probably thinking, but that's still your family. Yeah, I understand that instinct. But being related to somebody does not automatically grant them unlimited access to your peace, your integrity, your career, or your emotional stability. A lot of people stay trapped in unhealthy family systems because they confuse boundaries with betrayal. They are not the same thing. Boundaries are not punishment. Boundaries are information. They teach people where access to you ends, and manipulative people almost always react badly when access gets restricted. That's why toxic relatives suddenly call you selfish the moment you stop solving problems they created themselves. The guilt trips usually start right after the free labor disappears. Something else I learned through all this? People who genuinely love you do not constantly place you in situations where you must destroy yourself to prove loyalty. Read that again. Because that lesson alone probably would have saved me years of emotional confusion. My father wanted me to risk my career, my clearance, and potentially my freedom to protect Connor from consequences tied to his own decisions. and somehow I was supposed to view refusing that request as disloyal. That's not family support. That's emotional extortion wearing a family label. And honestly, I think a lot of adults carry invisible versions of this every single day. Maybe your family pressures you financially because you're the successful one. Maybe you're expected to tolerate disrespect because keeping peace matters more than your mental health. Maybe every achievement gets minimized while your mistakes get archived forever. Maybe somebody only calls when they need money, influence, childcare, emotional labor, legal help, or damage control. Pay attention to patterns. Patterns tell the truth faster than apologies do. One of the hardest things I ever accepted was realizing some parents never emotionally mature past control. They may provide financially, they may look respectable publicly, they may even love you in their own limited way. But emotionally safe people do not weaponize guilt every time they lose influence over you. And once you understand that, you stop chasing closure from people committed to misunderstanding you. That changes everything. You stop over-explaining boundaries. You stop defending every decision. You stop treating your peace like a group project. I'm not saying any of this lightly, by the way. Cutting emotional dependence on family systems hurts, even when those systems are unhealthy, especially when they're unhealthy. There were nights after the investigation started where I sat alone in my apartment, wondering whether I'd become cold somehow, whether military life had hardened me too much. Then I'd remember something simple. Healthy love does not require self-destruction. It just doesn't. And if hearing that makes something inside you exhale a little, maybe you needed that reminder too. Because at the end of the day, one painful truth changed my entire life. Some people will only value you when they need access to what you can provide. Real healing begins the moment you stop confusing that with love. One thing movies get wrong about integrity is that they make it look exciting. Big speeches, dramatic music, crowds cheering while the honest person walks away victorious in slow motion. Real integrity usually feels a lot less cinematic than that. Most of the time it feels uncomfortable, inconvenient, lonely, and financially stupid. And that's exactly why so many people compromise it little by little without even noticing. I learned that the hard way sitting in government buildings full of people whose entire careers disappeared because they convinced themselves one small lie didn't matter. That's how almost every disaster starts. Not with evil, with justification. This is just temporary. I'm helping family. It's not technically hurting anyone. What's going to find out. You tell yourself the compromise is small enough to survive. Then eventually the compromise becomes your personality. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Integrity is not built during easy moments. It's built during moments where dishonesty would clearly benefit you. That's the actual test. And unfortunately, family pressure makes those moments 10 times harder. Because when strangers manipulate you, your brain recognizes danger faster. When family manipulates you, your brain often recognizes obligation first. That's why so many good people get protecting behavior they privately know is wrong. They're not trying to become dishonest people. They're trying to avoid guilt. There's a difference. But the consequences usually don't care about your intentions. When my father asked me to endorse Connor's clearance review, part of me understood exactly what he wanted emotionally. He wanted the family system restored, Connor protected, the company protected, the family name protected, and my role in that system had always been predictable: absorb pressure quietly and keep functioning. That was my job growing up. Connor made messes. I stabilized outcomes. But adulthood eventually forces you to confront a brutal question. How much of yourself are you willing to sacrifice just to remain acceptable to other people? Because there is always a price, always. Sometimes the price is your peace. Sometimes it's your self-respect. Sometimes it's your reputation. And sometimes, if you keep compromising long enough, you wake up one day realizing you no longer recognize yourself at all. That's why I need people listening to this story to understand something important. Small ethical compromises are never actually small, especially in careers involving trust, military, law enforcement, healthcare, finance, government, education, anything where people rely on your honesty while making serious decisions. Professionalism is not just competence. Professionalism is restraint. It's the ability to maintain standards even when emotions are screaming at you to make an exception. And honestly, that's exhausting sometimes. People love saying, do the right thing, until the right thing becomes personally expensive. Then, suddenly, everybody starts negotiating morality like it's a used car price. I remember one night, about 2 months after the investigation started, I was sitting alone in my apartment eating microwaved soup straight from the container because I was too tired to cook like an actual adult. My phone buzzed with a message from an old family friend, not someone close, one of those wealthy Northern Virginia social circle people who knew my parents through charity events and golf tournaments. The message said, "Your father made mistakes, but family should handle things privately." I stared at that sentence for a long time, because that mentality right there destroys people. The idea that protecting appearances matters more than protecting truth. That accountability becomes betrayal the second family is involved. That silence somehow becomes loyalty. No, absolutely not. If your version of loyalty requires dishonesty, intimidation, manipulation, or enabling destructive behavior, that's not loyalty. That's fear wearing loyalty's clothes. And a lot of families operate exactly like that. They teach children early that maintaining the image matters more than confronting the dysfunction. Don't embarrass the family, don't expose problems publicly, don't challenge unhealthy behavior, don't disrupt the system, even when the system is slowly poisoning everyone inside it. What changed my life was finally understanding that peace built on dishonesty is temporary by definition. Eventually, reality collects payment, maybe publicly, maybe privately, but always eventually. Connor learned that. My father learned that. And honestly, I learned it too, just from the opposite direction. Because doing the right thing does not automatically feel rewarding in the moment. There were nights where I questioned myself. Not legally, emotionally. I wondered whether I'd been too harsh, too distant, too clinical. Then I'd remember what my father actually asked me to do. Risk my clearance, risk my career, potentially risk federal charges. Also, nobody else had to experience consequences tied to their own decisions. And once I looked at it plainly like that, the emotional fog disappeared. A lot of people watching this right now probably feel trapped between truth and belonging. I get it. That tension is real. Humans are wired for connection. We want family approval. We want peace. We want relationships to survive difficult moments. But you cannot build healthy relationships on top of permanent self-betrayal. Eventually, something breaks. Either the relationship breaks, or you do. And if I can leave people with one lesson from everything that happened, it's this. Losing toxic approval hurts. Losing your integrity hurts deeper. Because approval comes from other people. Integrity is what lets you sleep at night once everybody else finally goes quiet. A couple months ago, I was standing in line at a grocery store in Arlington, buying coffee filters and frozen blueberries when I realized something strange. I wasn't anxious anymore, not temporarily distracted, not having a good day, actually calm. And if you grew up in a chaotic family environment, you know exactly how unusual that feeling is. Because people who grow up around emotional instability often become addicted to tension without realizing it. Chaos starts feeling normal. Hypervigilance starts feeling productive. You get so used to managing everyone else's moods that peace itself almost feels suspicious. That was probably the biggest change after everything happened with my family. Not the investigation, not the headlines, not even the silence afterward. It was the quiet, the complete absence of emotional emergency management. Nobody calling to manipulate me, nobody testing boundaries, nobody subtly reminding me that my value depended on how useful I was during crises. For the first time in my adult life, my nervous system finally stopped acting like a smoke detector with low batteries. And honestly, that felt more freeing than revenge ever could. I think a lot of people misunderstand what healing looks like because social media turned recovery into branding. Everybody online acts like healing means moving to another country, cutting your hair dramatically, buying expensive journals, and posting inspirational quotes over sunset photos. Real healing is usually much less cinematic. Sometimes healing is just sleeping through the night without replaying old conversations. Sometimes it's not panicking when your phone buzzes. Sometimes it's realizing you no longer need to explain your boundaries 12 different ways, hoping emotionally immature people will finally understand them. And sometimes healing is accepting that closure may never come from the people who hurt you. That last one took me years. Because deep down, most people still hope difficult family members will eventually wake up one morning transformed by self-awareness and accountability. Maybe sometimes that happens. A lot of times it doesn't. And waiting forever for emotional maturity from people committed to avoiding it can quietly waste decades of your life. That's why one of the healthiest things I ever learned was this: stop explaining boundaries to people who benefit from ignoring them. Seriously. Some people understand your boundary perfectly the first time. They just dislike how it limits their access to you. That's not confusion. That's resistance. There's a difference. For years, I believed if I just communicated more carefully, performed better, stayed calmer, achieved enough, or became useful enough, eventually my family relationships would stabilize. But unhealthy systems rarely reward health. They reward compliance. The moment you stop participating in dysfunction, people who depended on that dysfunction often react like you betrayed them personally. That reaction says more about the system than it does about you. One thing I really want viewers to understand after this story is that protecting your mental peace is not selfish. I know some people were probably raised hearing phrases like, family comes first, blood is thicker than water, you only get one family, okay? And you also only get one nervous system, one life, one future, one mind. And sacrificing all of those things just to maintain access to unhealthy relationships is not noble. It's self-abandonment. That doesn't mean you stop loving people automatically. It just means love stops requiring self-destruction. Big difference. I still think about my father sometimes. Not constantly, not emotionally, just honestly. I think about how much energy he spent building an image instead of building trust. I think about how terrified he became the moment systems outside his control started holding him accountable. And I think about how many families quietly operate exactly the same way while pretending everything is normal at holiday dinners. Because this story was never really just about military on track or federal investigations. It was about what happens when somebody finally stops participating in a toxic emotional economy. That's the real shift. The moment you stop negotiating your dignity for temporary approval. And I know that's easier said than done, especially if you were raised to believe your value came from performance, obedience, or emotional caretaking. But trust me when I say this. The version of you constantly begging for validation is not the real you. It's the survival version. There's a difference. The real you starts showing up once fear stops making every decision. Once guilt loses authority over your life. Once you realize peace feels better than proving yourself to emotionally unavailable people. That realization changes everything. You stop chasing. You stop performing. You stop treating your worth like it's waiting for external approval stamps. And eventually, life gets quieter in the best possible way. Not empty, peaceful. There's a reason I ended this story standing alone on that balcony instead of surrounded by dramatic revenge celebrations. Because freedom is rarely loud. Real freedom is waking up one morning and realizing nobody controls your self-worth anymore. Not your parents, not your past, not the people who underestimated you. And if you watch this entire story all the way through, I genuinely hope something in it helped you feel a little less alone in whatever family situation you might be carrying privately right now. A lot more people understand this kind of pain than you think. They just don't talk about it openly. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if you want more stories about family dynamics, quiet resilience, emotional strength boundaries, and rebuilding self-respect after difficult relationships, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There are a lot more conversations people need to hear.